Overview of Aristotle's ethics from the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle approaches this very, scientifically, if this is ancient, right? We can't really use that word in that way, but he tries to classify things, right? And see what different things need, what different things are, what's special about this thing versus that thing, and so on and so on and so on. Instead of asking the big, unwieldy question that someone like Plato's going to ask, what is it to be good? What is goodness? Aristotle wants us to focus more specifically, species, on the kind of thing you are. And what is a good thing of that kind? A good tree, this tree I drew is not a very good tree, obviously. It looks a little thin in the trunk here. Right? A good tree is going to be the one that thrives, the one that kind of grows to its full potential. What's potential there? That's tricky. That requires a big inductive process of experiencing and interpreting. But, ask any gardener. It's not tricky to know the difference between a healthy rose bush and a sickly rose bush. Aristotle's going to attempt to find ethics in an examination of human nature. So our question isn't just the big, unwieldy question, what is it to be good? What is a good human? And if we understand clearly enough what it is to be a human, then what it is to be a good human sounds actually pretty manageable. Let's think about the natures of things and the purpose of things and tools, because it's really easy with tools, right? But let's make it a little less easy. Suppose that we are transported into an alien civilization, and when we awake, we find ourselves at this alien construction site, and suppose we, for some weird reason, just want to take an interest in, tools, alien tools. What could this one be? What could that one be? How would we try to figure it out? I think what we try to do is look at the different properties that the thing has, and especially watch the thing being used. Okay, so watch the thing being used. Wait around for a while. Wait until you see the alien carpenters or whatever come by and pick up the tools and start using them. It'd be pretty quick after watching them used over and over again that we see, that's what that one's for. What it's for. Purpose. Teleology. Of course, not every use is going to be a guide to the nature of the thing and the purpose of the thing. I've tried to drive a nail with a shoe before. It doesn't work very well, but, we'll use all sorts of things as all sorts of things when we need to. So you can't just trust that watching someone use the thing is going to solve all your problems. No, still some mysteries there. But the way it's being used, and especially the way it's being used that kind of leans into is concordant with its properties, okay? So if it has a really sharp edge to it and it's not being used as a cutting tool, that's probably not being used correctly, right? But when you see something that's being used as a cutting tool and it has really sharp edge and a handle and everything, well, this is pretty clear. This is a saw. This is used for sawing or for cutting of some kind. So the hammer, we look at its properties. We look at the way it's being used, and we can find its purpose that way. And once we find the purpose, we understand the nature well enough to find the purpose, then we can start thinking about what makes a good hammer, and what makes a weak hammer, a weak hammer. Interestingly, actually, the word we use, virtue, in English, comes from I think it's the Latin word vir, V-I-R, vir, which means man. Virtue is strength. The word actually, etymologically, comes from the idea of manliness. And if you think about virtue in a Homeric sense, right? Ajax is a virtuous person, Achilles is a virtuous person. And these are people who are strong in certain ways, but not just the big fighty ways, right? But all sorts of ways, ways that aren't unique to the weir of the species, of course, naturally. But the idea of virtue is the idea of a strength, right? So purpose is going to help us distinguish between a strong thing of that kind, right? What does it take? What kind of qualities does a thing need to be a strong instance of that? And what kinds, make it a weaker one? It's all tied to purpose. Virtue isn't actually like good or bad in just any sense. Virtue is strength. Virtue is strength. And vice is weakness. Don't forget that. The hammer has a number of distinctive features, and those features, right, its shape, its sturdiness, those features help it to accomplish its purpose, its telos, which is driving nails, serving in construction that way, right? Now, the human has a particular distinctive feature for Aristotle, and that is to be reasonable. The human is specifically, right, the rational animal. So we've got all kinds of things in common with animals, which means in order to reach our goals, we're going to need the right kind of nourishment, we're going to need the right kind of health, we're going to need the right kind of society, we're going to need certain resources, we're going to need certain kind of bodily integrity, right, to be healthy. But what it is to really flourish as a human, which let's say is like a tree, right? What we're after, what our purpose is, what reaching our potential would look like. Flourishing as a human, a particular human kind of flourishing. We're not for just any kind of activity, but this prolonged being, growing to potential, to what our nature allows us to reach. And what's so special about our nature? Reasoning. So it's going to be a kind of flourishing that involves reasoning well. Okay, so that is what a human is after. Now, knowing the purpose of a human, knowing the telos, the potential that it's growing towards, virtue is going to be a quality, a habit, a way of being, a propensity, right? A quality that helps us to flourish. Now, like I said, lots of things are needed to be a flourishing human, right? You need certain kind of health, you need certain kind of resources, you need certain kind of food, nutrition, right? You need all sorts of things. Respecting your functioning as an animal. But a human is capable of so much more than just, say, a pig, right? The kind of perfections a pig is capable of are not insignificant, but being a rational animal, right, who we are, what we're capable of, is so much more. Surely, right, the physical virtues that we share with a pig of, plumpness, roundness, having the right kind of figure, having, being a big one. Those kinds of physical traits, sure, go into our flourishing, but they're swamped by the value of moral virtues, by the value of what happens in our mind, of what we're capable of pursuing and achieving and all that, right? So, as much as things like, outward appearance, size, Aristotle has this interesting thing to say that, like, beauty has to do with large size. If you are a small person, you can be well proportioned, but you can't be beautiful unless it's on a larger scale. Beauty requires a larger scale, and I find that funny with today's standards about shrinking people down too small. It's crazy. I mean, there's lots to be said about how irrational so many of our standards are, but Aristotle has the kind of standards of a gardener or a shepherd, a swineherd to the animals under their charge, but understanding all the more significant human reason is. So, what it takes to be a good human is much more than what it takes to be a good pig. Take fear, for instance. Does it much matter how pigs manage their fear? I mean, sure it does. Do they have a lot of opportunity, control over their fear? Do they make decisions through all that? The opportunity, I think, in the swine psychology for excellence is rather diminished compared to a human's perspective. So suppose that you're walking down the street and you come across a fire, and it seems pretty clear that there are people inside, and there's an opportunity here to do something good, to reduce some suffering in the world, to maybe go in, but there's risk. Of course there's risk, right? So what do we do with this risk? Well, first, let's say courage isn't just ignoring any kind of risk, right? It's how do you manage fear? Now, there should be some fear in your decision-making. Not too much that it keeps you from doing what's called for at that time. Not too little that it keeps you from doing what's called for. What's called for? Actually, there's a whole other category of virtues called intellectual virtues in Aristotle. You gotta be smart to be good. You gotta see what's called for. You gotta read the situation right. A lot of things that a lot of people are missing around us of just like reading the situation right and seeing clearly what's called for. It's always empathy. Anyway, so we've got to manage our fear. We've got to turn our fear into a good decision, the decisions that reflect a flourishing life. Now, you look at this and you say, oh, there's a 10% chance of if I go in there and try to save the 3 people, 10% chance that I would die in the effort. That's not good. Oh, but that means a 90% chance that I won't die. Okay. And if I tried, what are the odds of rescuing anyone? Well, what if you saw there's a 20% chance of rescuing someone? Only an 80% chance of it being completely fruitless. Okay, so weighing these odds, right? What is the 10% chance of your life ending due to you? Is letting fear influence that decision when there's something that good at stake? Is letting fear influence that decision and rob the community of your efforts there, rob the other people who are there, just as deserving as you are of your efforts? It seems that backing out over an only 10% chance of dying, that's going to be letting fear influence your decision-making too much. If you see what's really called for, if you read the risks correctly, and hey, sometimes, when you risk things, it doesn't pay off, right? But you follow the right risks and you aim at the right goods, you don't let fear get in the way there, that seems like a courageous action. Now, virtue, it's a character trait. It's a habit. It's not something you do. You don't do virtue. You develop habits. You develop virtues. Habits of estimating things correctly. Habits of emoting in the right ways at the right time. Of letting the things that matter and dismissing things that don't, right? Like I said, you got to be smart to be good. Now imagine a different scenario. You walk on this raging fire, and it's clear that there's someone in there. And you estimate very clearly that if you tried to get in there and save that person, there's like a 99% chance that you perish. And there's hardly even a % chance that you could do any good entering that building. Letting yourself go in anyway, that's foolhardy. Virtue ends up being, most of the time, a mean between too much and too little. So the virtue regarding pleasure, right? How much are you valuing pleasure? How much are you undervaluing pleasure, right? Pleasure is a good thing. Do you let pleasure, your valuation of pleasure, enter your decision-making too much or too little? That's going to be vicious. That's going to be a vice, a bad habit. The right amount, that's a virtue. Now, what is the right amount? What's not the right amount? My reading, which I think tends to line up a little more with Thomas Aquinas, is that we define too much and too little by a notion of flourishing. We want to grow ourselves into the best example of a human we can be. We want to live to our potential and forget physical potential. Like, sure, health, aim at that. But do we want to like perfect our bodies? Most of us don't, right? What's the potential that we want to raise ourselves to? It's to flourish as a human. It's going to involve a lot of intersocial relationships, I think, and a lot of self-development in a lot of different ways. But what's going to count as a virtue and what's going to count as a vice? Well, I think we need to go back and think about this notion of flourishing. What does it mean? What does it look like? What is a human nature worth growing up to, right? Do you have a conception of the kind of life that you aspire to live, not because, oh man, I just want all those nice things, but because, no, really, I think that's an admirable life. I think that's the good life for a human. In my mind, it's Jimmy Stewart's character, George Bailey, in It's a Wonderful Life. I think that's a beautiful depiction of a strong person. Several strong people, actually. Mary needs her own movie, I think. Anyway, but what does strength look like? And in Mary's movie, maybe she is the librarian. And anyway. When are we sacrificing too much? When are we sacrificing too little? These are important questions, right? So virtue is very much tied to what is the flourishing that is worthy of us seeking. So we evaluate then our habits based on, my pursuit of pleasure, for instance. Is this too much? Too much what? Too much for human flourishing. What would that look like? Why would something be too much pleasure or valuing pleasure too much for flourishing? Well, it could be self-destructive. It could be harming other people in the community, people who have every right to exist just like you do, people who are just other humans trying to flourish like you are. That's shameful, right? You don't want to find yourself doing things that are self-destructive. You don't want to find yourself doing things that are shameful. And of course, that shamefulness is self-destructive too, if you think of the self in a certain kind of way. So we've got an image, we develop an image, and this is through, moral education, right? It's what our stories are supposed to provide for us, right? We get this image of virtue, of what we should be aspiring towards, right? Think about it for your life. What's worth aspiring to? A life of leisure? Maybe a life of deserved leisure. What would make it deserved, right? I mean, you want to expend your efforts. You want to expend your efforts in ways that make the world's a better place. Anyway, you get a picture of flourishing. And from that, we reason about, are we developing habits that are getting in the way of that flourishing? Are we developing habits that help us to flourish in those ways? And so we pay attention to what we develop. We be careful. We take care to avoid the extremes, to avoid anything that's going to get in the way of this idea of flourishing. And when we're flourishing, that better be something that's good, not just for you, but for the whole community.